Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Dr. Randy Olson. Randy is a Ph.D. evolutionary biologist from Harvard and a graduate of the legendary USC Film School with 3 documentaries under his belt. But one day, he got fed up with how scientists were doing such a poor job of talking about their work. Therefore, he decided to join his Hollywood skills with a scientific background to uncover and teach the ABT framework, which has been called the DNA of story. He's now got 5 books on the subject, including Houston, We Have a Narrative, Why Science Needs Story, and his latest, Narrative is Everything, the ABT framework and narrative evolution. According to his LinkedIn profile, he has also been the director of slug operations at Microslug Productions in Azerbaijan for the past 51 years. But I have a feeling I shouldn't take that part of his story too seriously. Ladies and gentlemen, Randy Olson. Randy, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Francisco. Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yes, I have a feeling you noticed what I did there with that introduction.
You did the A, the B, and the T, the whole package. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
we're gonna obviously talk a lot about the ABT framework in this conversation. But before that, can we just talk about what is the biggest problem with communication and the problem that got you down this road? Just the other day we had a quick chat and you shared with me an article by James Carville. So should we sort of talk about that and what got you into this whole mess to begin with?
Putting it simply, probably the single biggest problem with communication is the failure to listen. And that's kind of universal and ubiquitous. My first book, Don't Be Such a Scientist, got really nice reviews, but the fellow who reviewed it for Science magazine, which is the most important science publication in the United States, said, great book, but he failed to address the single biggest problem for scientists and really for anybody when it comes to communication, which is the inability to listen. And the further you go with this stuff, the more you realize that's at the core of the big problems. Nowadays, a lot of people come to me for help. And if they're doing something really super duper important and awesome and interesting, I say to them, I'll give you some help for free, no charge. I only ask 2 things. Number one, that you listen, and number 2, that you experiment. And that's as much as it takes. When people are listening, experimenting, you're starting to get smarter. You figure out things. But there's so many people that I've made that deal with them verbatim. And then after a few months, you realize the person's not listening to anything. They really got it in their head. Like, I know how to do this. I'm really good at this. And then at that point, you kind of have to pull the plug. Like, why bother? So yeah, listening, I think, is the single biggest problem. And you see in the United States, for example, society's become so polarized. The 2 sides aren't listening to each other. They're just off on their own thing. We're right. We're right. No, you're right. No, we're right. Everybody's right. So yeah, listening.
But after you get past the point of listening, I think we can both agree that there's also another big problem, which is even sometimes when you have people's ears, the way you're speaking to them is just not helping you. It's not helping drive your message home. So in the article, James Carville, who is a well-known political strategist, he's a Democrat, and he's talking about how Republicans are very good at messaging and Democrats are terrible at it. So not to go into the whole politics of it, but one example he uses, which you quoted to me when we talked, was about climate change. How
should I just read the quote? I've got it sitting right here in preparation. Yes. Why not? Instead of paraphrasing it, it is such a powerful quote. It's a perfect starting point. So this is 2 weeks ago in Vox. James Carville, Democratic Party strategist, gave an interview. 5-6 years ago, I teamed up with him for a while and tried to have some impact on Hillary Clinton's campaign using the ABT framework, and we hit a big brick wall there. The one fun thing that came out of it was he had me come speak in his course at Tulane University, and he's an amazing guy, an amazing communicator, has very deep narrative intuition. So in this interview 2 weeks ago, here's the bit. Let me read it to you. The interviewer asked him, Republicans aren't just more comfortable lying. They're more comfortable with slogans and sound bites. And that's partly why they're more effective at defining themselves and defining the Democrats. James Carville said, "Let me give you my favorite example of metropolitan overeducated arrogance. Take the climate problem. Do you realize that climate is the only major social or political movement that I can think of that refuses to use emotion? Where's the identifiable song? Where's the bumper sticker? Where's the slogan? Where's the flag? Where's the logo? We don't have it because with faculty politics, what you do is appeal to reason. You don't need the sloganeering and sound bites. That's for simple people. All you need are those timetables and temperature charts, and from that, everyone will just get it." Well, that's not how the world works. That's not how people work. And Republicans are way more disciplined about taking a thing and branding it. Elites will roll their eyes at that, but I'd ask, quote, "How's that working out for you?" Most people agree with us on healthcare and minimum wage and Roe v. Wade, and even on climate. So why can't we leverage that? So that's what you're talking about there. And yeah, that is a really powerful and sad, profound quote that gets to the heart of it all. And it's a fundamental divide. There was a study done in 2019 in Denmark by a group of linguistics folks. And what they did was they looked at the language of political speeches from around the world, and they examined over 1/3 of a million political speeches from the right and the left. And the title of their article tells their whole conclusion, which is Liberals Lecture, Conservatives Communicate. And that's exactly what Carville's talking about there. Liberals lecture, conservatives communicate. And I love liberals. I've voted Democrat my whole life. I support their goals, but they can just be a waste of time. They're their own worst enemy so often. And they are communicating right now so many of these issues on such an elite, up in the clouds level. And that's in the other part of that interview that was widely quoted. What Carville talked about was the term he developed was faculty lounge communication. Basically, that these folks are addressing these issues, even issues of race and immigration, all those sorts of things that are such broad and relatively simple issues in terms of the masses being involved with them. And they're addressing them in language that is so complex and obfuscated and erudite that the public just isn't hearing them. Just like, what in the world are you talking about? Come down to our level. And that's the crucial thing. And that's what I learned many, many years ago when I left my position as a professor. I was a tenured professor of marine biology. So I'd done the whole career as a scientist and felt that I was very, very smart, and decided that, well, that was easy conquering that world. I guess I'll go conquer the world of filmmaking, moved to Hollywood. And within a few months, got my ass handed to me by an acting teacher more than anybody else, but plenty of other instances. But in particular, an acting teacher who just ripped me to shreds the first night in the acting class in front of all the students, and she said, "I don't even want you in this class because I know your type. You're an academic and you do not listen. And I can't do anything with you if you don't listen. You can't make somebody act if you don't." Acting, one of the fundamental phrases in acting is reacting, where you have to be in the class or in the scene and in the moment, and you have to be looking at everything around you, taking it all in, listening, because the audience wants to know how you're going to react. They don't want to watch you give some big prepared speech. So that was the beginning of this journey that it's 26 years later. And I have, I think, listened to a few things, learned a few things. And if there's one thing I learned more than anything else, it's when I've gone back to the academic world and tried to relate to them what I've learned. All you get from them is shut up, you're wrong, you're stupid, you left the ivory tower, you're outside there, you don't understand our world, you blah, 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 blah. So a lot of brick walls, but that's the journey.
Something you mentioned earlier, or James Carville mentioned when he talked about reason and emotion. There's this quote from Donald Kahn, who's a neurologist, which I think exemplifies that perfectly. He says the difference between reason and emotion is that reason leads to conclusions and emotion leads to action. And I think that's one of the big problems. I talk to people about this all the time, and I talk about corporate communication and why meetings are so boring and why presentations send everyone to sleep, and why it's so difficult to pay attention to them, is this issue of whatever they're doing with their communication is only appealing to our rational brain, not to our emotional brain, and it's not engaging enough of our brain took hold our attention. But something I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, perhaps up until now. But it's really strange how there's this idea of how it's, I'm not just going to say immoral, but it's beneath some people to resort to more emotional communication. So, telling a story or appealing to people's emotions is somehow beneath us. We should just communicate in this strange way that no human being has ever communicated, and that doesn't work. I think you call this, I'm not sure if you're referring to this particular phenomenon, but you call this story phobia.
Yeah, you're right. It's a very big problem with the with heavily educated people. They believe so much in reason. They think that reason solves everything, and evidence-based decision making and things of that sort. You're making me think of 1985. Man, that was a long time ago. I went to back when I was a coral reef biologist. I was working in Australia and went to the International Coral Reef Symposium in 1985. Coral reefs were still pretty healthy around the world, and the scientists were studying them. 95% of the scientists were studying the science of coral reefs. Very little involvement with environmental issues back then. People didn't even quite grasp yet that there could be any threats to coral reefs. They seemed like a boundless resource. And one of my friends was a woman who'd been working she was American, but she'd worked in Japan, Okinawa, for many years. And she gave a talk at this meeting among all these scientists. And she was a coral reef scientist herself. But she gave a talk about this local community there in Okinawa and how they had all these parades and ceremonies and things like that, where they celebrated the ocean life around them and had tributes to them, and signs and everything like that. And yet the majority of the things they celebrated didn't live in the waters around Okinawa anymore. They'd all been fished out and ravaged and eradicated. And she pointed out that the overfishing is so bad, it's spread throughout the Ryukyu Islands there, and that if it keeps going like this, there'll be nothing left. And her presentation was very humanized, and it was about the people, and it was very emotional. And oh my God, that night at the big dinner, all of a sudden I heard this fracas going on over in the corner, and there were some of these a-hole scientists, these older white male scientists, just ripping into her. There's no place at this meeting for that kind of garbage. You sitting up there and getting emotional in front of us over coral reefs and, blah, blah, blah. All you're doing is distorting the whole picture. And she ended up, screaming back at them. You want to understand? That was my first little dose of the intolerance in the science world at times for the more humanized approach. And again, it's their own undoing. It's what they've done. Exactly what Carville said there about the climate movement. That's been the bane of their existence. And to give you a bit more in-depth version of what he talked about there, in 2002, I was just getting involved with the issue of overfishing, a campaign I ran for about 4 or 5 years called Shifting Baselines. And one of the first things I did was went to Seattle and gave a talk at the University of Washington, where I'd been an undergraduate by coincidence, but I went there because I was invited by some friends. And the talk was about overfishing, but afterwards I ended up doing a session with a whole bunch of professors that were marine biology professors there, or ocean science professors. And I remember we were in a conference room, like 20 of them. It was just more of a discussion with them, wasn't a talk. And they said to me as a group, this was 2002, they said, we're very concerned because we're being told now we need to start educating these students on this issue of global warming that people are starting to say is going to be a problem. And what concerns us is that global warming, the science of global warming, is biogeochemistry. It's about carbon cycles and oxygen cycles and nitrogen and all these sorts of things. And that's the most boring stuff in ecology. And I knew exactly what they were talking about because I'd taught ecology for a bunch of years. And when you teach ecology, at least back then, you put all the interesting stuff, the interspecific interaction stuff about competition and predation of all these different creatures and mutualism and all these fascinating, fun stories. That's what you go through most of the course. And you try and stick that biogeochemistry stuff at the end of the semester in hopes that you can stretch out the other stuff and never even get to it. And you look at most of the textbooks, textbooks back then. It was at the back of the textbook. The stuff is so dry and dull and boring by definition. It's inorganic chemistry. It's not organic chemistry. It's hard stuff for people to learn. Well, as soon as the global warming issue began to emerge, the scientists took the stage front and center and basically said to the environmentalists, step aside. You don't understand the science here. We're dealing with very complicated science. We're not going to win this issue if we don't get the science out there. Science has got to be number one. And the environmentalists pretty much yielded to them. And by 2005 or 6, a producer named Laurie David began making a documentary about global warming. She felt that it was a very urgent, important issue. Now, probably around 2002 or 3, she started it, because for 3 or 4 years, she was working on this documentary, and she did the responsible thing. She put together a team of scientists as her advisory board. And I know this because one of them I interviewed for one of my films later, and he told me all the stories over lunch one day. And they did their conscientious job as scientists. They looked at versions of the film and the outline early on and all these sorts of things. She interviewed all of them, and they began going through draft after draft, giving all these notes and, wanting the thing to be exactly right and accurate and evidence-based, yada, yada, yada. And they bogged the whole process down. And it got to the point of 3 or 4 years to get this one documentary done for HBO. And eventually, by 2005, we had the summer of 5 major hurricanes in the United States. Is it 4 or 5? I think it was 5, with one of the last ones being Katrina, that devastated New Orleans, and in a very public way. And basically, as this one scientist said it to me, he said, we were still in the middle of editing this documentary, trying to get it finished to air on HBO. And it did eventually air, called Too Hot Not to Handle. And he said, Laurie David finally came to us and said, okay, now we want to thank all of you for your efforts on that documentary, but it's now a crisis. We've now had a summer of 4 or 5 hurricanes, and global warming is here. And I was in Hollywood that summer, and I heard those stories going around. I was at environmental events, and everybody was saying, oh my God, it's already here. The climate has already changed. This is what they were warning us. We're going to get every year now. We're going to have 5 of these giant hurricanes that are going to devastate the landscape. And so there was an urgency that emerged. Out of that urgency that fall, she ended up grabbing Al Gore, who'd been out wandering the countryside giving his sad and lonely slideshow about global warming, and putting him on a stage at Sunset Gower Studios in Hollywood that was just down the road from my office at Raleigh Studios. And 3 of my friends went to I think they had 2 or maybe 3 performances that they filmed, and then edited all that together into Al Gore's movie, or what came to be known as the Al Gore movie, but it was really Laurie David's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And she had basically said to all the scientists, this is too urgent, and we just can't afford to have you in the room this time around. So we're going to go do this damn thing, and we're going to have it out immediately by next spring. That's what they did. They made their movie, Damn the Torpedoes. You got to admire her for her bullheadedness to get something done like that. Certainly had the impact, but it came at a price, which was it had very poor narrative structure. It did not tell a good, compelling story. It was not humanized the way you would like it to be on a broad human level. In interviews with the director, Davis Guggenheim, he said, he talked about, we tried to bring Al to life because Al Gore was a bore, Gore the bore. And he's an inescapable bore, nice guy. One of my closest friends worked for him in the 90s when he was the vice president. And she kept saying to me that by about 98, she was saying, it's the Veep. He's going to be the next president. And I heard this from so many different people who all said he was really a dynamic speaker live. People go to live events, and Al Gore was great, but that didn't translate into film. And Gore the bore. So they went ahead and made
it's an interesting example of the sort of the Democrat approach to communication and the Republican one. Whereas when you have Al Gore running against George Bush, one of them seems significantly more concerned about not saying anything that is not completely correct, but boring people to tears while doing so. Whereas Bush, we all know, He wasn't a liar. I think he just got very confused. He suffered from the same problem his father did, where sometimes just word salad came out. But he was a much more charismatic figure. We kind of forget that now. But compared to Al Gore, he was the guy you wanted out to go out for a beer with.
That was the whole catchphrase in 2004. Who would you rather have a beer with? Exactly. And by the way, as I get going on these long-winded stories, jump in and interrupt me and guide it however you want to, because I'll go on
You
and on.
mentioned something.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the Al Gore movie. That one of the problems of the Al Gore movie, which I think was already probably miles ahead of anything the scientists would have had they had their way with it,
Which
but
is the
was
problem.
the
Yeah.
was the lack of narrative structure. So there's a few different things you talk about when it comes to narrative structure. I wanted to start with the smallest one, which I thought was fascinating, which is the Dobzhansky template. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this thing correctly.
You could be like the undergraduates that call it the Bob Jansky.
Well, Dobzhansky, I think, is close enough.
Yeah,
So,
or I think Park Howell now calls it the DZ. So that's his
right,
abbreviation. Everybody has a hard time with
right.
it. So Dobzhansky, but that's all right. Keep going.
Dobzhansky. Okay,
Right.
okay. So what is the Dobzhansky template?
Yeah, great question. I think it's very deep, because for starters, I think I have fairly deep narrative intuition, going back to my childhood. And I don't know that I'm a great writer, but I have some sort of sense for narrative structure. And the proof of that is 5 books that I've written on it. And
Randy, just a second, because you've
yeah.
used this term twice now. What do you define as narrative intuition?
Oh, yeah, great. Thank you very much. This is your job to stop me. Don't let me get going too fast on things I haven't explained and defined. Um, in Hollywood, the great screenwriters and the great screenwriting instructors talk about what they call story sense. And great screenwriters have got this intuitive sense for how to tell a story. They're not sitting there following a recipe. They have got a basic structure in their mind, but once they've got that structure down, then they're telling a story through their own intuition. So I took that term story sense, and in my Houston We Have a Narrative book, modified it into the realm that I'm working in, into the term narrative intuition. And what that means is that you've got such a good gut feeling for the 3 fundamental forces of agreement, contradiction, and consequence that you can shape a narrative over time intuitively. You're not following a recipe book or something like that. And this is what you get a lot of students like, well, can you give us the whole template for a 10-page paper? No, you can't. At some level, you got to have this intuition stuff. It's got to be driving you. And we've worked now for 7 years in our narrative training program. And now thousands of people we've worked with this ABT structure with, and ABTs and but therefore has you opened the whole segment with. And what you see over time is you begin to get a feel for people who have deep narrative intuition from the outset and those who don't. Most people have kind of a moderate amount. There are some strange people that have absolutely none. They don't even know what we're talking about, and they just never pick it up. And then there are some people that walk in the door that just have got it, kind of a rhythm in how they talk and explain things. So narrative intuition is important. And nowadays, I believe it's kind of like 3 different elements to it. I think there's a genetic component. That's one thing. I think that kids early on, some of them are just able to regurgitate things and make structure out of the world, and others don't. They just, the vast majority of them, not so much. There's environmental thing. If you're raised in in the deep South of the United States, it's a culture of the tradition of storytelling. Or I grew up in Kansas, and there were some of these farm boys that grew up on farms, and they clearly just sat out there with nothing in their brains other than telling stories all day long. And it shapes the brain, I think. And then I think thirdly, there's a developmental element of the neurons being formed in the brain over time. And if you're incubated in a storytelling environment, you are developing neurons that probably after age 25 can't be redirected and restructured. That's just my hypothesis, but I think I'm the guinea pig that tests that idea, which is I tried to reprogram my brain at age 38, and I definitely did some improvement, but I never, it's not like I could go back to square one. The 21-year-olds in my film school class ended up being far better storytellers than I did. And part of the reason for that, this is something that someday I hope the science world will listen to me and somebody investigate this. I firmly believe that when you become a scientist, there's sort of a fork in the road around age 15, where you start to study science books, chemistry, math, physics, all those things. They're all non-narrative. They don't tell stories. They're all just information, fact, 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 fact. And I think you're stimulating certain brains or neurons in your brain that are growing still up to age 25, and you're hardwiring yourself in a non-narrative direction. In contrast, people in the humanities are reading hundreds to thousands of novels during that decade from ages 15 to 25. And I think they're developing their neurons in a different direction. Who knows? It'll probably be 20 years before anybody can test that. But that's, I think, what goes on. But to get back to my evidence of narrative intuition, and this is the stupidest of all stories, but I swear it's true. When I was like 6 years old, apparently, my mother would tell these stories many, many years later. And I remember her telling the stories. She said when I was like 5 or 6 years old, I would sit and watch these TV shows during the day, like Cowboys and Indians, or I don't know, Combat was one of them, or just all these kind of adventure story things. And then she said she would be doing housework around the house, and I would follow her around regurgitating what I'd just taken in on TV, like a tape recorder or something. And there are 5 kids in our family. And she said, none of the other 4 did anything of this sort. None of her friends with kids she ever talked to, none of them ever heard of any kid that's like a human tape recorder at age 5 and 6 years old. And the question is, why did I feel the need to just regurgitate all this crap that I was taking in? I have no earthly idea. All I remember is my mother telling those stories, but I think there's a connection there, which is there's something in the configuration of my brain way back then that interested me in that sort of structuring of information coming at me, and somehow, for some reason, feeling the need to propagate it. And I say all of that because then many years later, my first year doing my Ph.D. in evolutionary ecology, being a teaching assistant in the evolution course, we had this big fat textbook, and every chapter began with a quote from somebody famous. And one of them began with this quote from Theodosius Dobzhansky, the great geneticist. And it was an essay he'd written in the 1970s titled, "Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution." And the point of that essay was that as a biologist, you can go out and look at all these different weird shaped creatures and giraffes and platypus and all these bizarre shapes and forms, and none of it makes any sense at all until the day comes that you learn about evolution by means of natural selection. And in an instant, when you learn that is the story of change in the world of biology, and suddenly it all makes sense to you. And that's what's really fun in learning evolutionary biology. Suddenly you look at all these skeletons laid out on a table of different creatures, and you see, oh my goodness, they've all got the same basic body plan. They've just taken these different bones and stretched and shaped them in different directions. But at the core, the skeletons all have a spine. They all have 4 appendages, all these sorts of things. And so you see that evolution is the story of change for the world of biology. And that one sentence stuck in my mind. That would have been 1978 when I first learned it. How many years later would 2005 be when I was making my movie Flock of Dodos? And in the last segment of Dodos, kind of like the last quarter, is where I kind of went philosophical there, trying to synthesize everything that the whole film had been about, the controversy around the teaching of evolution versus intelligent design. And in that last quarter, I used that. And I said, we can modify Dobzhansky's famous quote to apply it to today's world, which is that nothing in today's society makes sense except in the light of the information explosion. And I honestly believe to this day that is the narrative of my life's experience, which is that I was brought into a world in the 60s and 70s that all made sense. Everybody felt like they had a handle on the world. It was all great. And then in the 80s, suddenly information just began to go exponential. And I got to live through that. That was when I was doing my PhD. And I saw the transitions happening where people began to shift from conscientiously trying to keep up with the information in their field to beginning to get neurotic and nervous, like, wow, I can't keep up. And then it turned into comedy, and it turned into everybody laughing at parties about, I've given up. I don't try and read the journals anymore. There's just too much. But there was a time when people felt that they could really keep on top of the information in their field. That transition happened in the 80s, and by the 90s, it was laughable. And so that changed everything, not just in our society, but it changed people's psyche, their being, their attention spans, their ability to laugh, to feel grief and sorrow. Everything human changed as a function of the information explosion. And then as a result, that was 2005 when I used it in the Dodos movie. Then in 2013, I wrote the Connection book with my two workshop co-instructors, Dory Barton and Brian Palermo. And in that, I modified that Dobzhansky quote into what we now call the Dobzhansky template. And I just tossed it out there and I said, look, here's an interesting little tool. This one sentence, just fill in the blanks. Nothing in whatever your topic is makes sense, except in the light of what you think is the really driving factor. And lo and behold, people began using it, especially in our Story Circles narrative training program, where we gave them the ABT as the central tool. And then after 2 or 3 years, I began interviewing some of these groups on their experience. And over again, they said the same thing, which is the ABT is really powerful. But, the one tool that over and over again, we would have these moments where it just brought everything into clarity is the Dobzhansky template, because you sit around the room, the 5 people around the table, and everybody takes a shot at it and swing in the dark. And then in an instant, somebody says the right word nobody thought of, and everybody, oh my God, that's it. And to bring that to life, as a matter of fact, in a few hours, I will be doing my podcast, ABT time. And we're doing a special little feature today in which it's called Fire Above and Below. Going to have a fire conservation expert from California talking, combined with a fire expert from Melbourne, Australia, about the issues of wildfire, and they call it bushfire down there. And so last Friday, we very conscientiously got together for an hour of discussion. And there's also Jen Martin as my kind of co-host from Australia. So the 4 of us, and we began working on this stuff. And I brought out the tools. You bring out the toolkit, and I said, all right, let's go to work on what we're going to talk about, because I don't want it to be just an hour and a half of rambling about fire. I want this to be a journey that we're going to take the audience on and build to a climax. And then I pulled out the Dobzhansky and I said, let's give this a shot. And it was perfect. It was a perfect 3 or so minute long exercise where we started off, and you and the guy from Australia. And so it was like nothing in the history of dealing with fire as an issue makes sense, except in the light of what. And his shot at it was ignorant arrogance. And we all soaked that in, and well, that seems a little dismissive. And then we had 2 or 3 other ones. And then finally, Jen said, misguided confidence. And bingo, we all said that's exactly what the whole history of it is, both in California and Australia. It's a story of misguided confidence, where over and over again, they've thought they know how to manage this stuff. All right, we're going to do this, and everything they do makes it worse. And that just
let me peel that back a second, because I'm just afraid some people might have been lost and not caught exactly what we're talking about with the Dobzhansky template. So the idea here is you were essentially trying to find what's the most important word, or 2-3 words about a subject. And if you haven't got that, there's a very big chance that your talk or your presentation or your paper or whatever you're doing is just not focused enough on what actually matters. So for example, I could, if I'm giving a keynote and trying to convince people why they should tell stories, I could go with something, the Dobzhansky template for me would be something like, nothing in effective communication makes sense except in the light of stories, or except, if I want to be more granular, except in the light of emotion. If you don't have emotion, if you're not dealing with that,
what was my
narrative?
No, what was my word at the beginning when you asked me that?
Listening.
There you go. See, you remembered it because it boiled it down to one simple little thing. Exactly. And that is exactly what I was doing right there. And actually, the key word I left out in describing this whole thing, the key word is theme. And when you take creative writing courses and literature and things like that, and really great instructors, this is what they beat over our heads in film school about. Nothing that you create is going to have much resonance unless you're working around a theme. You have to have one central thing. And that's what all the great stories that endure over the ages, if you dig deep in them, you'll find, this is a story about betrayal. This is a story about endurance. This is a story about loyalty. They've really got one thing. Usually you can boil it down to one core theme. So that's what it's mostly about. And that's the question to ask everybody. What's the theme that you're working around? This is just a simple little one sentence template that in the practical sense helps you find that one word by putting it into this sort of mode of thinking. Nothing in your topic makes sense except in the light of what's the one thing. But it's really a tool to get to the theme. And as you say, once you've got your theme, then you really got a great deal of power, and you can use it in presentations. You don't have to say verbatim, I'm here to tell you about nothing in the world of communication makes sense. You can simplify it down and just say, I'm here today to talk to you about one thing. One thing is listening. That if you don't listen, you're never going to communicate well. So let's dive in. And this is what messaging is about. This is what I've been trying to explain to many politicians. And turns out, what first thing you learn about politicians, they're the worst listeners of all. They don't listen to a damn thing. They're unbelievable. Once they get started on their campaign, there's no stopping them, and they think they've got it all figured out. And that's exactly what we found out with the Hillary Clinton campaign, talking to those people there. They're already, once a candidate is out the doors on a campaign, they've got the blinders on. They're just like, this is what we're going to do. And they're not listening to anything. And if people aren't listening, you're not communicating, and then you're wasting time.
So one question I have about the Dobzhansky template is this. I agree with the theme. I agree that how much focus it brings to whatever you're trying to communicate to have that one thing. But my question here would be,
But
is your contention that there is always one theme, or that you have to choose a theme, even if other things also play a very important part? Because if you don't, it's very difficult to communicate a message that has multiple themes.
I think you have to push yourself a long ways. And ultimately, if you really do work hard on it, think it through, and finally say, you know what, we got three different things here. I can't really wrap it in one thing, then that's fine. But the problem is that most people don't push themselves. And the arrogance of your average person who thinks they're so good. One of the things we say with our training is sort of drawing from the world of Alcoholics Anonymous. Their basic principle is, we can't help you until you come to us and admit you have a problem with alcoholism. And so don't come to our support groups and sit there and tell us that you're fine or whatever, or don't listen to us. We're only going to work with the people who come in the door saying, you know what, I finally realized I have a problem. And we've developed that same attitude with this narrative stuff, which is, don't come to our training if you don't think you have a problem. And we get this. It's unbelievable what we get. We get some of these people. I just got to tell you about one guy. We've run with this ABT framework course now. We're in the 14th round. So for the past year, every month is a new round. And without mentioning what government agencies we had around last year, where one guy was in the course, there's 30 people in it. I'm doing my Zoom thing, and we have a chat window. And the guy turned into a bully in the chat window. He got in there, and every time somebody would try and pose a question, he would answer it. They would say, question for Randy about this and that. And then the guy would type in the whole answer. It's like this, that thing, Mr. Know-It-All. And he ruined the whole chat window, because after a while, nobody wanted to put a question there because they knew what would happen. This guy would jump in, Mr. Know-It-All, and answer everything. And then when the whole course is done, like, we don't do any evaluations. We have a dozen people that run the thing with me, and we're constantly talking to people and getting our feedback that way. But these government agencies have a standardized evaluation form that everybody has to fill out. And then they insist on sending us all that garbage, and we just kind of glance at it because it's so sort of boilerplate that it's largely useless. But what was priceless was this guy, and it had to be this guy. One of the questions in their evaluation form, they asked them on a scale of 1 to 5, how much, what was your level of knowledge of the subject before you took the whole training program? And he's the only guy ever to give himself a 5. Yeah. And like, people usually like a 2 or a 3, and even us, the instructors, we give ourselves a 4. You're never done with narrative. And the only guy ever, Mr. Know-It-All, gave himself a 5. So when you get people like that, there's absolutely nothing you can do with them. They're not listening. They're just kind of bulldozing through. But when you get the people that listen and they really are experimenting, trying things out, it's really fun to work with them and see how they can start to shape things. So it's a long process.
There was something you said right at the beginning, and I left it dangling, and I should have picked it up there and then, which was, you mentioned, I believe, the 3 primal forces of narrative: agreement, contradiction, and consequence.
Yes.
Okay, so because that's gonna be we could finally get to the to the ABT, but what I wanted to just get it out there. I don't think we need to talk about it in a great deal, but I think this helps people understand it. I love it that you have sort of three frameworks. You have the extremes of the communication spectrum. So the first one I think everybody recognizes, which is the end framework. So everybody that has children has seen a child tell a story that way. Everybody that has a boring colleague or relative, that's how boring people or people who have not been trained to be better storytellers tell stories. I did this and I did that and I did this other thing and I did this other thing. And what that does is bore people. Just nothing goes anywhere. And then on the other side of it, you have what you think believe you call the DHY, right?
Yes.
So the despite, however, and yet, it's all contradictions, right? This contradicts that, that contradicts the other thing, and it's really hard to follow the plot, which then leads us to the ABT, which is and, but, and therefore. Which you got or realized out of Trey Parker from South Park, right?
That was my first alerting to it, but then I quickly went to work researching it, and they didn't come up with it. They had picked it up from their screenwriting instructors. The fellow who first articulated, as best I can see, is a fellow named Frank Danielle. In the 1986, he gave a speech, and he was a legendary screenwriting instructor. I was lucky enough to have his course the year before he passed away at USC. He became professor there. And in the speech in 1986, right in the middle of that speech, there's a very simple couple little paragraphs. And the first one basically says, when we write first drafts of screenplays, but you realize this applies to everything, we fall into the dreaded pattern of and then, and then, and then. It's in the revisions that we begin to change some of those and thens to buts and therefores. And that's what turns it from just being a diary entry into a story. And that is so true. And I try to explain to scientists it's the same thing. You know, when you do your research, you eventually sit down and you put together the first draft, which is and then, and then, and then, and then. And that's fine. That's where you start. It's just having the wherewithal to realize, wait a second, we got to work harder than this. That is almost all this stuff just comes down to work. Are you interested in working or not? Turns out most people aren't. Most people are really lazy. Thus, the title of the new book, The Narrative Gym. This is the entire philosophy that we've developed, which is and I learned this from the improv actors. They talk about improv acting. Improv is like a muscle that has to be conditioned over time. An improv actor can't just jump up on a stage having not done improv for 2 years and expect to do a good performance. You have to get into shape. You have to be working on the stuff day in and day out. My colleague, Brian Palermo, is a really accomplished improv actor. I've worked with him for 10 years. And for over 15 years, he's in a weekly show on Wednesday nights that I've been to, probably about 25 times. But he does that to keep in shape. And so he doesn't get paid much of anything for it. It just gets together with 5 or 6 fellow actors. You have to stay in shape. You have to bring this physical fitness mentality to it, which the academic world just doesn't buy into. They just, that's part of their arrogance. Well, we're so gifted and brilliant. People hang on our every word. No, they don't. Maybe they did in the 1950s and 70s, 60s, and 70s, but they don't anymore. We're in a world of too much information, and you people need to bite the bullet and go to the narrative gym and try and get yourself into some sort of shape. But it takes work. That's at the core. Nothing in, maybe I'm going to revise my Dobzhansky. Maybe it's not about listening. Maybe it's about work. But getting back to
I
your
find it
question.
interesting you mentioned the 50s and 60s because I am still baffled by the fact that one of the most watched PBS documentaries of all time is a 6-part interview with Joseph Campbell. So on prime time, PBS aired this thing. So the series of I think, hour-long interviews or conversations, really, they're not interviews, with a journalist and Joseph Campbell, who is the person who wrote The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is the person that codified the hero's journey. So to some degrees, he's the father of Hollywood storytelling as we see today, and this was a big success. People were tuning in to watch them, talking about life and the universe and how stories fit into this. 6 hours long of that thing, whereas today I find it very difficult to believe that 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 type of show would have a primetime audience the way it did back then. This wasn't cable. This wasn't people specifically tuning in for it. This was it was open TV still.
Oh, I was
And
there. I remember it well. Yes. I was married at the time, and my wife was obsessed with it. And I'm sorry, but I sat and tried to watch that, and I thought the guy was boring. And I still can't make it through any of his books, Joseph Campbell. I think he was not a great communicator, but he had a brilliant mind for structure and analysis. And that's the place that he plays in history, which is that he came along in the 1930s and 40s in an era where storytelling around the world was something that had never really been looked at that much analytically. And he posed a very simple question, which is all these different religions and cultures around the world, at the core of their practices are stories. And he asked the question, are their stories all completely different, or are there any similarities with how they tell these stories? And at the beginning of his book, he says that. And it's a great little quote I always use in our course, which is, he said, there are, of course, countless differences between how they told stories, but this is a book about the similarities. And that's what I'm interested in, is seeing if there's similarities, because that's how we advance our knowledge. That's what science does. You go out and look for the simple unifying theories. And that's what he found, was sure enough, as you went around the world, there was a commonality in the structure of how these stories were being told, and they were all about heroes. And that's the title of his book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, meaning that it's the same story, just a different face in every one of these different cultures. And that was the core of those interviews. Although there was the answer to what you were, mystified by there was the New Age movement. Those are the people that locked on to him, and his thing was follow your bliss. And there was kind of an element of laziness, I think, in that catchphrase, follow your bliss, meaning, don't be constrained by the system. Just go and do whatever you want to do. It's sort of like it was a latter-day free love and era, something from the 60s, follow your bliss. Just go do whatever you want to do. Don't let anybody tell you what you ought to do in life. And I wonder how many people ruin their entire lives by following their bliss, ending up unemployed and broken.
Yes, I can see how that would happen. So let's go from the lofty peaks of Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey and the hero with 1,000 faces to the super practical applications of the ABT. Now, for anyone who hasn't caught on to this yet, the ABT is essentially just a different way of saying set up problem resolution. It's just more codified because you could actually use the words in the ABT to structure what you're saying, but it's and is usually the context, the parts of the story that are in agreement, then but is where you introduce the problem or the conflict or whatever you want to call it, and therefore are the consequences. And I really like how in the latest book of yours that I read, Houston, we have a narrative. I really like how you blatantly said you're going to do it and then used the ABT to structure the chapters. And it works really well. Then it just gives that dynamic just works really well. And you've tried it in so many different things now, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. Endlessly. In fact, we're going to try it right this moment, because you're going to tell me the one sentence ABT of your professional journey that's brought you to podcasting right now. Give me a one off the top of your head, one sentence using and button there for.
Right. So I won't do it about podcasting because I think that it's slightly broader than the journey. But so I spent many years working as a financial advisor, and everything was fine. The bills were paid. The home life was okay, but I was bored. I didn't feel particularly excited getting up in the morning, and I thought, there's got to be more to life than this. And so I decided to follow my bliss, as Joseph Campbell would say, which was telling stories and getting up on stage and talking to people. And at the perfect moment to launch that career, when COVID hit, I started working as a professional speaker and storytelling coach.
Perfectly, perfectly executed right there. That, I mean, for everybody listening, you just nailed it. That was, there was nothing boring in what you just said. It was not the least bit confusing. There's a lot more detail now. We could spend the next hour as you go in depth on what you just presented there, but you absolutely nailed it there. And now let's take a look. And this is what we do in the course is first thing you want in the end material is agreement. And you want that first part to have no drama in it, no conflict, no no contradiction, nothing that's going to activate the narrative part of somebody's brain. And you did it perfectly. Said I was leading this life and it was great and everything was just fine. And you got to the end of a boring story, everything was fine. So, that was it. Then you flipped it on the word but it wasn't enough. And that's exactly what you want. And it's right on that word but. That is your best hope of grabbing and focusing attention in an audience is the word but. Many of my friends, one of my best friends speaks a lot. He's one of the world's top experts on medical marijuana. And just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were having a conversation. He said, I've gotten to the point now when I give these big talks and I get into the Q&A, and if I find myself at all losing my way, all I have to do is say one word, but. As soon as you say but, the whole audience leans in. But what? But what? You can't end a sentence with but. It instantly cues something's coming and it's going to be in a different direction. And that fires up the narrative part of the brain. So that's what a lot of this stuff comes down to. And the 3-step model that we've developed now that's in the new book, The Narrative Gym, that is the core of the training program. Step number 1, we've learned through pure experience, is the best thing you can do. Once you come up with your ABT that you just did there, then you dive into the middle of it and you go to the but statement. That's the statement of your problem. And the first thing I would be doing with you, if we were doing this live in the course, you would have that ABT that you just said to me. It would be up on the screen for us to work on. And I would say, all right, let's go to the but. In 5 words or less, what is your problem in this narrative? And you would answer, life wasn't fulfilling. There's 3 words that told the whole problem. That's the driving force of that ABT that you gave us. And that's it. That was your problem. Life wasn't fulfilling. Once you identify the problem, then the second step is to go backwards in the ABT, back to the and, because the and is the setup. And you can't figure out how to set up a problem until you know what the problem is. So you've got to get that problem locked in. And in these, we do what are called working circles as a part of the course. People get together in 5 individuals and work on one person's ABT. And one of the rules is you can't go forward until you've got a total agreement on what the problem is. Some of these working circles, they'll spend the whole half hour just trying to figure out what the problem is. And that's all that they'll do. And they'll end up a half an hour later, like, we're still working on exactly what is the problem. And you find a lot of people, you say, what's the problem in this project you're doing? And they'll roll their eyes and then they'll itemize like 4 different problems. And there's your problem right there is, can you boil it down to the one thing? But then once you've got that problem laid out, then you go backwards to the setup. And now that tells you 2 main things there. You want to give us the ordinary world. What is the whole thing, which is about your life? And then you want to also try and weave in there, what's at stake, what's important. And you mentioned your family in there. And so you already had it. Your instincts were really good with how you crafted that thing in a moment's notice off the top of your head with no. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, listening to this, he had no forewarning of that. I throw that, at people out of the blue. You did a great job. And then just mentioning, your family, we could work further on that. What's at stake? Because that's what makes the but have a big impact. Is if you've told us about something, in all your life, you just had hoped that you would have a happy, fun home life and you got the family and everything seems to be perfect. This is your whole life's dream. But when you finally got there, turns out that wasn't enough. It's by setting up before you get to the but that you have depth of impact. And these rules then radiate out into the world of literature and all this sort of stuff. You start to see how universal this is, all great novels and things like that. Really great novels over the ages. One of the things I noticed when I was growing up and reading some of these epic novels is that a lot of the best ones have got just page after page of and stuff, 100 pages at the beginning, just getting the story laid down there. And some of it you got to really plow through. And then it starts to engage and get good, like Moby Dick or something like that. You got to lay down all this and setup. But if you do it and you pay the price, then when you start to get to the drama, the contradiction, it starts to get really fun and interesting. So that was perfect. What a great demonstration. Well done.
Thank you. I think it must be said, in fairness sake, that I followed your work for a while. I've very recently read one of your books. So although I hadn't voiced it in that exact way, I think it was percolating in my brain to some degree. So it's not as if I've just been introduced to the ABT and I'm doing it off the top of my head. But the one thing I think is really powerful about it, because I know that one criticism that you have gotten before is how this is sort of a dumbing down of narrative or of anything. And I think it's just people need to realize how that setup of agreement, contradiction, and consequence, that, I mean, agreement, we might call it something else. Normally I would call that context. But if you have, if there's context, conflict, and consequence, that's what a story is. And you can do
Yeah.
that in an elevator pitch that lasts 30 seconds. You can do that in a 3-minute story, or you can broaden that out to a much larger scene of a movie or a novel or a paper. Or you do that in your book. Every chapter, or most chapters at least, have that type of ABT structure. And I find it really interesting how a lot of people seem to have come to the BT part of it, at least, on their own. Because there was Trey Parker, we talked about, from South Park, who said that, if I'm reading a script and there's too many ands, I know it's boring, so I replace the ands for but and therefore. I spoke to a different storyteller who works in a completely different space. His name is Matthew Dix, and he's probably the biggest winner of all time of The Moth.
Mm.
He's won that thing, the Story Slam, 51 times. And in his book, he talks about, if your stories you want to add excitement to your stories, just add buts and therefores. Like, he
There you
doesn't
go.
talk about, and he had later found out that Trey Parker had said the same thing, but naturally just migrated to the same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. This stuff it's not that new. The philosophers in the 1700s figured it out. Hegel and Kant and others came up with what was called the triad, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. These are the three forces. It's just not that new. And unfortunately, everybody wants things to be new. And so they come up with all this complexity to throw on it. And people tend to look down on things. Oh, that's just old. That's for old people, old fashioned, whatever. But it's just simply the way that the world works, is how communication works. I came up with an ABT yesterday in preparation for this little discussion, which from my world is lots of people work on science communication, and good luck to them, but they don't have a model. I do, therefore I win. Sorry, that's the battle that I'm in the thick of right now, is that nobody else has got a model. Nobody else has a model. They're all out there. And what they have is, just boxes and boxes of all kinds of tips and techniques and things like that thrown together. But the ABT is a model. And the more we work with it, including today, we'll be doing another round of the course. This is round 14, another session. I think, what are we at, 14.3 today? And with every session, we're spotting new elements, but it's basically the and but therefore provides a model on which you can hang these things. So I was just telling you about those elements you hang in the opening material, which is the ordinary world and what's at stake. But there's all these other bits and pieces that we're learning can slot in there. And it becomes a systematic approach to communication that starts simple, then radiates into infinite complexity. That's a model. Nobody else has a model. And so I have a hard time talking with a lot of these other people because they don't have a model. I'm interested if somebody feels they have a competing model, but there isn't any competing model because, as Park Howell had said, the ABT is the DNA of story. Once upon a time in the early 50s, there were multiple theories, models of how DNA was structured. But eventually, Watson and Crick showed, here's how it's structured. There's 4 nucleotides, and then there's the double helix, and that's it. And after that, there were no other competing models. There's just one way the DNA is put together. There's only one way that this narrative stuff is put together, these 3 forces: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. And it's not at all surprising you say that guy that won all the moth competitions converged on the button to therefore. That's it. It's just, this is just how the brain works, nature.
I guess that the problem a lot of people have is that, so there's a few problems that I can see easily enough, and I don't think we're going to have time to go into them into any major detail. But one problem is that some people have narrative intuition and can't quite understand that other people don't, the curse of knowledge and all of that. So I think I do, to a great extent. So I write my own stories or craft them or tell them. I'm not thinking about structure. But what I have learned by teaching this stuff is that even for people that, some people don't have that narrative intuition, so they need the framework to hang whatever they're trying to say on, because it won't come naturally to them. And two, even for people that have narrative intuition, they're not going to use it as a structure to put it together, but they can still use it as a diagnosis tool. So you think you know what you're doing, you don't need this, this is dumbing it down for you, fine. Now that you've done it, go back on it and check, okay, have you gotten this? Are all these points there? Are they in a reasonable order so it flows? Because if not, then your intuition was a bit off there. And I say this with no with no arrogance whatsoever, because I just did it this morning. So I wrote a story, I put it on social media, and then I looked at it and said, hold on, I am I haven't laid out like there is context, but I put it after the problem. So the
Hmm.
contrast between where, there was a problem my daughter was having. She was sort of being bullied in school at 4. It was like a tiny bit of bullying, but still being bullied. And I hadn't explained how she was. So when I introduced the problem, you don't get that contrast. So I just went and inverted the order in the story. And as soon as I looked, it's like, okay, that's it. Now
Yeah.
I've given you a normal kid that is super confident. And now this has happened, and because of that she's now doubting herself.
Mm.
But we even sort of the natural storytelling, between inverted commas, you miss stuff, and if you don't have some sort of framework or diagnosis tool, you can't catch yourself, because perhaps you're just being arrogant and thinking I never make a mistake. But I think any type of structure framework that is basic enough that it can be applied broadly is something people should learn, if
Yeah.
nothing else, just to check, okay, but that didn't really work. Why? Oh, yeah, I know what I've done. This
Yeah,
is not there.
but
That's not there.
and I'm sure this will offend all your viewers, but there's only one framework. There really is only this and but therefore these three forces: agreement, contradiction, and consequence. There aren't any competing models, and we get this all the time. Why do we get this all the time? One simple factor, which is money. There is so much money to be made as communications and consultants and trainers. I didn't know this. When I became a scientist, I became a scientist to try and gather knowledge. Then I went into communication to try and gather knowledge. And then I began to learn, realize that most of the people in communication are there to make money. And so they have to have their own technique and the most cockamamie of things. It all gets crazy, but you gotta do our course. You got to sit in on some of the stuff. You would find it absolutely fascinating. And we're on a journey there's about a dozen people who work with me on it, all unpaid. Everybody comes to the sessions over and over again because you're working out the narrative part of your brain. And part of what this journey has been over the past, especially the past year and a half, where in doing this thing, same thing as you, the pandemic just changed everything for me. Suddenly, training that we were doing once every 3 or 4 months, we're now doing on a daily basis with the course. We're like every other day running a session. And one of the long-term things that we've learned in the beginning, sort of following on the South Park guys, we thought that the basic thing was get rid of the ands and the buts and the therefores. It's all about the buts and therefores, and get rid of the and, avoid the and thing. Over time, you come to realize the but and the therefore, that's the easy stuff. That's the visceral stuff. Once you got the problem established, it's obvious what the therefore is going to be. And the problem is kind of there already. The hard part over the long term is the and stuff. It's the context, what you say. And one of the things that you see is kids are really bad at that. When we have kids, high school kids do ABTs, they start with the problem. They don't know the context. They don't know what to put in that blue material. You find in the blue material at the beginning of the ABT, they're already into the problem. But that is going to result in a shallow experience. And older people, that's one of the beauties of age. With age comes experience. With experience comes the ability to craft context, to understand why these things are important in terms of the big picture. Kids don't grasp the big picture. So there are just simple physiological limitations of narrative that people don't want to talk about, because most people want to believe that, oh my God, kids are brilliant. They can do anything. No, they can't. Sorry. Hate to give you the truth. There are a lot of things kids can't do yet. They need to gather experience. And with age comes the knowledge and the ability to create, to put things into context. And you're right. Context is the be all and end all eventually.
Yeah, and one thing that I've learned and I've been teaching people uh, is that if you know the end, then you should know what the beginning is to a great extent, because the beginning needs to be as much the opposite of the end as you possibly can, without you straining the truth of what it is, because that's how you get a narrative arc. because if at the end you're at the same place you were at the beginning, then it's, nothing much has happened. Even if a lot of stuff happened in the middle, it will be a very unsatisfying story if you come back to the Shire and everything is exactly the same. If Luke goes back to Tatooine, his grandparents or uncles or aunt and uncle are there, and he still has his hand. He hasn't tried to shag his sister. Then it's all, what's been all for? What's the point of this, right?
Exactly. And a simpler way to put it is the journey from A to B is great, but a journey from A to A, not quite so interesting. It never
Yes,
went
true.
anywhere.
True. So Randy, I did mention your books. I might have gotten the name of the book wrong. So is your latest book The Narrative Gym, or is it Narrative is Everything? Or is it two different titles of the same book?
So this is the book that came out of the course. And the thing I
Okay.
love about it so much is this is the Houston book that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
And what is so great about the new Narrative Gym is when you look at the thickness of the
Yes.
two,
It's a much shorter book.
it's
Yes.
much more concise. It gets right to the point. It's more practical.
Yeah.
It's the thing that should be on everybody's desk because it's really the nuts and bolts of how to use the ABT framework practically.
Okay, so that one is out now. You mentioned that your podcast is ABT time.
ABT time. Yes.
Okay, then I would expect that that's everywhere. Everywhere podcasts are found,
Yep.
and I think we're gonna get this out in time, so anyone is interested in the course can look at it. When are you doing the course again, or you had a big event or a course coming up not long from now, right?
Oh yeah. No, the big thing coming up is our narrative blitz, and we ran the narrative blitz on April 14th, and we had 1,500 people sign up for it, and it was tremendous.
I was there. Yeah.
You were there. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
And did you thoroughly enjoy it?
Yeah, it was very good. I think it's for just so people have an idea. This is essentially a whole bunch of people. A lot of them are scientists using the ABT in all sorts of different ways. So you can see how you could apply that framework to pretty much every type of situation, and from people that are not natural communicators. So this is not a whole bunch of people that are great at speaking, just doing something slightly different. These are people that, with most likelihood, are horrendous at speaking, and they are communicating their ideas in a concise way.
Yeah, and it was it's 24-minute talks in the course of 2 hours, in which when I pitched the idea to the folks at National Park Service who were our co-sponsors on it, they groaned and said, "Don't you realize how sick people are of sitting on Zoom? You're not going to get anybody to stay with you for 2 hours on Zoom." We ran the event, and 80% of the audience was still there 2 hours later. And why is that? Because it was all massively ABT structured at multiple levels, every single talk, on and on and on. So it was so much fun, and people enjoyed it so much and wrote us a ton of emails that we're just doing the whole damn thing again on June 9th. And I don't know, maybe you could put the link on your website or something like that.
So I think I'll probably, this show probably come out around the last week of May, give or take.
Oh, great.
So I'll put all this stuff on the show notes, and when I put the show out on social media, I'll highlight that. So if anyone wants to jump on that, they could, because I was one of the people that left before the end, but just because of the time difference, because it was so late in Europe. By the time I had been in for an hour and a half, I was like, okay, fine, I need to get some hours of sleep, because unlike you, I'm not getting up at 6 a.m. to surf. I'm getting up at 6 a.m. to handle a toddler. So some of us need slightly more sleep.
We have different priorities.
Yes. Randy, this has been a great pleasure. I'm really glad we've done it, and thanks again for your time.
You betcha. It's really great. And therefore, let's do it again one of these days.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves. And until